Welcome to Politically Basic. I'm your host, Kyle Campbell. So glad that you're with me today. We are talking about a big topic, a pretty broad one, America's founding. And with me today, I have a genius in the area of understanding America's founding history and founders, Tim Barton, who is the president of WallBuilders. WallBuilders is an organization that uses original source documents to reveal historical truths about our founding fathers' faith and the religious principles they established. You guys equip people to discover this truth with documents and artifacts from the first 400 years of U.S. history. That is so incredible. And Tim, you also connect America's past essentially to our present. And I've witnessed it. It is electrifyingly fascinating. You're also a contributor for the Epoch Times and frequent guest on numerous television and radio programs. And I'm so glad that you're on this program with me today. So welcome, Tim, and thank you so much for joining me on Politically Basic today.
Well, I'm honored to be here. Thanks for having me on. It's great to be with you, and excited to be part of something you're doing to make a difference in people's lives in the nation. So it's great to be with you.
Thank you. Well, here at Politically Basic, you know how we roll. We're boiling it down and only talking basics. So I'm giving you a really big question, a really broad question, but you're our go-to guy. You know exactly how this all went down, and we're going to talk about the phenomenal books that you've written on it too. But Tim, what's the story of America's founding?
Yeah, so obviously there's entire courses on this. We're going to break it down as much as we can. And really, there's a lot of misrepresentations about the American story. The modern narrative today is that there were these really evil white people who came to America and did these really evil things. And the truth is very different than the modern narrative. But yeah, essentially, if you go back in time, you go to 1492 when Columbus sails the ocean blue, right? Kind of the beginning point. Most of us learned the old rhyme to adage in school that in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue. If somebody didn't learn that, that was the rhyme I learned. So that's where it all started.
Yeah.
And, right? Columbus didn't even discover America technically, right? He discovered some islands in the Caribbean, but those were islands. As this was going on in Europe at the time, you had this incredible highway that Marco Polo had opened up. You had this trade that was going all the way from Europe into Asia. It was amazing. And then you had the Ottoman Turk Empire that came in. And essentially, these people, the Ottoman Turks, realized that there's all these individuals that are traveling with these wagon loads of trade goods from Europe to Asia, from Asia to Europe. And they said, instead of us having to get jobs and make money, why don't we just start robbing these trains, loaded wagons that are coming through? And so that's what they did. They interrupted the trade route. It was known as the Silk Road. When that was interrupted, people were, especially in Europe, they were going, okay, we've just found these spices. Like cinnamon is delicious. I don't know if you had it on food, in a drink.
Mind-blowing, life-changing spice discovery.
Right. I need some more spice in my life, in my food. I don't want to give this up. And so they're trying to figure out, how do we get it? Well, the options were at that time, if you can't take this main road, well, we have these ships and we can sail our ships. And keep this in mind, right? We're talking about, they would go from Europe, they would go south around the continent of Africa.
It's wild that they could even make that journey in the first place.
Right. I mean, that's some commitment to spice, right? You really, whether that, whatever that spice latte, whatever you're drinking, that's some major commitment to get some spice. Absolutely. So they're sailing all the way around. Some people are like, well, let's just sail north, right? And so then you're going north, where freezing cold, frigid, terrible. And Columbus has this idea and said, hey, instead of sailing north around Europe and Asia, or south around Africa, why don't we let's just sail west? Because we know that the earth is a globe, and then we could arrive in Asia, make it so much simpler. And people thought, this dude's crazy. No one had really ever tried. There's no records. There were no reports and stories from people having tried to sail in that location, that direction. And certainly, I mean, you have the Vikings, right? Greenland, they're up in Canada, kind of the northern parts of North America. People knew there was something, but they didn't know it was all connected, and they didn't know what it was and where it was. So Columbus has this idea. At the time, Columbus is an Italian, and the Italians, they are the best mariners of the time. So they are the best ship captains in the world. They're pretty much sailing for Italy. They are Italians. And so when Columbus goes with this idea of the king and queen of Italy, they're like, bro, we're good. We own the market, right? Everybody's using our ships to get their spice. We're good. So Columbus has some brothers, and he's like, hey, let's check with some other nations, see if another king and queen will sponsor us. He finally ends up getting Spain to sponsor him. And early on, they're like, we're not going to do much because only sponsoring 3 ships, that was considered a very meager expedition. But they said, we're going to let you try it. All that going forward, Columbus discovers this area. And the reason even Native Americans were known as Indians for centuries, he thought he was landing over in like India, Indonesia, that area. And so he said that these are Indians, and there's so much misportrayal about Columbus. It's not historically grounded. There's a lot of narrative today that people think because it's what they've heard, but it doesn't make sense logically, but it's also not historically correct. And we can show the documents that verify this. But specifically, if you think about it, Columbus was sailing to try to open up trade. And if he landed somewhere, which he did, where there were no other nations with any kind of trading posts there. So he's thinking, I just hit the jackpot, right? I have a place where now we're going to have exclusive trading rights with these people. But if you're going to open trade, your motivation is I'm not to conquer, right? I'm not going to massacre or whatever else he's accused of. This wasn't a genocide movement. He's actually going to try to open up trade. There's so much to this story, which we write a lot about. The historians over the years have written a lot about. And when finally word gets back to Europe, nobody is really excited to do much yet. Spain's the one that starts early on. And Columbus has 4 voyages in his lifetime. It's believed his 4th voyage, he might have landed in like central kind of southern North America area, maybe Mexico, somewhere in there. He might have landed his 4th voyage, but pretty much he never landed on mainland North America to speak of. But because there were all these uninhabited islands with all these natives where there was an opportunity to trade. And also worth noting, Columbus never knew he didn't land in Asia. So like this is worth noting. Again, he thinks he has just found a portion of an area that has been uninhabited, undiscovered by these Europeans who are trying to open up trade with Asia. So again, he's got the market nailed down. As time goes on, Spain begins, the mainland of North America is discovered. Spain begins to put colonies there, and they have colonies in Florida all the way up through South Carolina. And interestingly enough, at the time this is happening, this is early 1500s. At the time this is happening, you can back up more than 100 years. You have the beginning of the African slave trade, the North Atlantic slave trade. And it's not the beginning of the slave trade, but it's the beginning of the exportation of those slaves, because there was already a slave trade in Africa for thousands and thousands of years. In fact, if anybody listening is a person of faith, if they're familiar with like the Bible, right? Whether you're a Christian or Jew, the book of Genesis from the Bible, and even if you're not a person of faith, you still might know some of these stories. Well, there was this guy in Genesis. His name was Joseph. He's the one that had the coat of many colors. His brothers sold him into slavery. Well, they were in Northern Africa. I mean, literally from the very beginning of the Bible, there was a slave trade in Africa. And I'm not saying anything that is any kind of revelation for anybody. Every historian's like, well, of course. I mean, there was a slave trade in Europe. There was a slave trade in Asia. There was a slave trade in Africa. That's just the way the world was at that time.
But I think that you're making a really interesting point, and I want to pause because I know you've got your dad's brain. You're just going, and I love it because I want to crack it open and let all this good information come out, and it's fascinating. But I want to just take a quick pause on the slavery note, because I think it has influenced so much about what we believe now as a culture and society in today's day and time about America being a nation that some people believe started slavery or that just promoted it. Of course, it's a part of our nation's history, but slavery has been in existence since essentially the beginning of time. And we want to talk about documentation. We talk a lot on this show about bringing the receipts, so let's bring them. You guys at WallBuilders have one of the largest, if not the largest, collection of historically factual, accurate, authentic, and provenly authenticated artifacts and documents. Yeah. You have the literal receipts to back all of this up. And so, regardless of how people emote or have an emotional reaction to this history, because there's tough stuff in it and there's very inspiring stuff in it. Regardless of your reaction to it, this is historical fact. Everything that you are saying is backed up by, I mean, how many artifacts do you guys have now in your
Yeah, so I mean, to your point, we have what's considered the largest private collection of original documents from the founding era, so early America.
Okay.
We do have the largest collection of documents from the Pilgrim era, from the Plymouth era.
Yeah.
We have more than 1,000 documents from like Jamestown and Plymouth, which nobody has more of documents from that era. We have in our collection, it's over 100,000 items in the collection. The vast majority of them are from the founding of America, so like the founding fathers. We have documents from any founding father anybody can name. We have documents from them. There were 56 guys that signed the Declaration. There were 39 that signed the Constitution. We have documents and signatures from all of them. So again, anybody can name. We would have letters or journals and documents from them, handwritten notes from them. And so as we're having this conversation, now to this point, it's worth noting, I have not said anything that is historically debated. Right? Because sometimes you can hear something and you can be like,
yeah, that's a really important comment to make here, is that everyone's on this page. No one's saying it's not right. Yeah.
Well, and it doesn't mean that somebody might not like it somewhere, right? Because I mean, sometimes something happens and we're like, I don't like that. Well, it doesn't. If you're a sports fan, right, and you're playing a team and they've got let's say it's football, and they've got a kicker who hits a game-winning field goal from 63 yards, you're like, I don't like that at all. Well, you cannot like it, right? But he still kicked a field goal from 63 yards to win the game.
Listen, Tim, every 365 days, I allegedly turn a year older. I don't enjoy it, but it doesn't mean it didn't happen. So I'm with you.
Valid, right?
Happened.
So you don't have to like necessarily history. And also one of the things that's worth pointing out is every nation's history is going to be a conglomerate, right? This giant ball of good, bad, and ugly. Because when you look at the story of people, anytime every nation has a story of people, right? And when you have people involved, sometimes people do really good things.
Right.
Sometimes they do really bad things, and sometimes it's real ugly. And by ugly, like even evil would be another word for that, right? Like there's times this happens, and this is as we're having this conversation, even acknowledging like a slave trade that was worldwide and universal. That there's a slave trade in Europe and Asia and Africa, which is really where all of the people were at that time. That's a pretty ugly part of the story of human history, but it's kind of worth noting, this was a story of all of human history, because everybody's story involves, I mean, even for our own, right? If we were going to tell our own life story, we'd have some really good moments. We'd have some not great moments, and maybe some moments where like, I don't want anybody to ever know about that or talk about those moments, right? Where we could have done some bad things, made some bad mistakes, but this is the reality of humans in general. And to pretend like that some people are only bad, some people were only good, that's a pretty dishonest take on looking at humans in general, looking at humanity, at civilizations, at nations, at empires. Because when you have nations full of people, there's going to be good, bad, and ugly. And I say that almost as a caveat, because as we look at the story of America, and sometimes as we tell history and we tell stories about some of incredible leaders from America's past, whether it's a George Washington or a John Quincy Adams, or like we can go down the list of some really amazing people in our nation's history, there are some who would say, wait a second, right? You're pretending like that America was this really great place all the time. No, I openly acknowledge we had some really bad leaders in American history who did some really evil things. And that is part of our story. The problem is in modern culture where we only tell the bad part of the story and then we spread that bad part out to try to make it the whole story.
Sure.
And so like even this notion of slavery saying, well, America's bad because we had slavery. There is no doubt that slavery is a stain and part of this nation's history. But where we fail to tell the whole story is if you go back in time, who were the first nations to abolish slavery? And as a nation, right, England did that in 1833, largely behind the influence and work of William Wilberforce. But then you had France, you had Denmark who did it. America did it in 1865.
Yeah.
America was the fourth major nation in the world that banned slavery. We did it in 1865 to the 13th Amendment. And people look and go, America, we had slavery, so evil. Okay, again, I'm not disagreeing that slavery was an evil stain, but we were the fourth major nation in the world to abolish slavery. How many nations were there that time? 128.
Right, and it was so relatively early on.
In our nation's history, it was.
Existence,
right. We had slavery in America for a shorter period of time than anywhere else in the world. And let me go back to this notion that we were the fourth nation to end this. If you were in a race, right? If anybody listening, if you've ever been in a race before, whether it's siblings or at school or in college, you've run a marathon. If there's 128 people running and you come in fourth place, we wouldn't go, oh, that was terrible. You're not very good. We would go, that's awesome. Right? Fourth place out of 128. That's really impressive. But nobody talks about the fact that we've taken significant steps in the equality movement in America, or that even part of the foundation laid in America for the equality movement, not just in America, but the movement that was taking place impacted the entire world. For example, the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." The abolition movement in America, their big argument was for equality because we are all created equal. Here's what's interesting. England, the ones that technically ended slavery first as a nation in 1833, you know, one of the things they used to say in England and their abolitionists arguing against slavery, they used to argue that all men are created equal. Guess where they learned that phrase from?
Yeah.
That was America.
Amazing.
Right? That was a Declaration of Independence.
Yeah. No, it's so interesting that there seems to be, and I love your take on this, you know, when there's something as terrible as human slavery, which we have happening in different forms to date and is getting worse to date. But when you have something as horrific as human slavery in a nation's history, do you think that there are those who believe and hold tight to the idea that it was so bad that it can only ever be bad, and that we can't look at the good that did come from? We can't look at the progress and even, you know, assign, you know, benefit to that and say like, hey, you know what, we did it quickly, we did it faster than other nations, or we did get through it, and we're still working every day, every year to improve, you know, racial relations in our country. It's something we take very seriously and spend a lot of time and thought on. Do you think that that is sort of siloed in a way for some people who just can't get out of the horror of it to see any good that's come out of it?
I mean, that is definitely one of the arguments today, right? That the stain of slavery is so bad that it tarnishes everything else in America, right? All of the good that America ever did or might have done is overshadowed by the evil that was done here. That's one of the arguments. Where this really falls short is if again, kind of just big picture, if we're just looking at not if I like it or not. Let's kind of look at the receipts, right? Let's measure this, let's track this, because you can data point some of this stuff. If you look, for example, right now at the nations of the world, there's 193 member nations that are part of the UN. There was a report that came out, I think either 2021 or 2022 is when the report came out, and it identified that 94 of the 193 nations that are part of the UN, and 94 of those nations, they had still not passed laws to abolish slavery.
Wow.
Slavery is still legal on the books in 94 nations.
I think people would be blown away by that statistic. I'm shocked. I didn't know that. That's absolutely incredible.
It's why when you look at China, right? I mean, you have the Uyghur Muslims that are enslaved in China, and nobody, I mean, contrary to what pop culture or the NBA, right? Or what some of these individuals might say about how great China is. No, right. Right. I mean, let's talk to people that have come out of communist China, and let's listen to their story, because as you know, we're in this culture that we need to hear everybody's story, and it's not. Some people argue it's not about what really happened. It's about what your experience was. And what's your experience? Well, if we're going to say experience, right, is our measuring rod, like that's a standard, then experience can't just be your experience. It has to be everyone's experience, right?
Right. And then you have a free for all. So you have a free for all. And then what do we assign truth to? What do we assign fact to at that point? If we're all seeing it differently, which we will, because we're human and we're not all the same human.
No, and we've all had different experiences, and in the midst of that, right, this is where you can devalue reality, because we make it so subjective that there's nothing universal we can come together on. So how do we function in society? But let's go back, right? If we're talking about, you have people escaping communist China and they're giving stories, firsthand testimony of what's there, of these slave camps, which by the way are real, and this is another thing that people dispute, but academically, right? The people that have actually done the research, this is not really debated if China has slavery. They're enslaving people. They're slave labor. It's similar if you look at North Korea. Now, North Korea, we would argue is worse in kind of their communist lockdown. But if you look in Asia, there's multiple nations in Asia where there's slavery. If you look in Africa today, estimates are there's more than 9 million people that are enslaved in Africa today. And there's actually slave trading blocks where people are still sold on the blocks in Africa.
Wow.
And the reason this matters, if the argument is, right, number one, that slavery makes a nation evil, well, then why aren't we talking about these other nations that are still doing this, right? Because America stopped this like more than 150 years ago. And then let's go a little further. If we're saying that, well, we just hate slavery and what it's doing to people, then why are you spending all of your energy saying America's evil and not trying to fight the nations that are still promoting and allowing slavery, that are still doing like the sex trafficking? And I mean, there's a lot happening right now, but this is where I would go back and point out a lot of what happens in America, this motive, people don't even know. They've bought into a much deeper and darker thought process going all the way back to Karl Marx, where Karl Marx, kind of the founder of Marxism, he taught there's only two classes or two groups of people. It's either the oppressed or the oppressors. And so then it's not about the individual, right? It's about what group do you fit in. And so if you are part of the wrong group, no matter what you've done or haven't done, if you're part of the wrong group, then you're an oppressor. It doesn't matter if you're a 4-year-old or 5-year-old, right? If you're part of the wrong group, you're an oppressor.
Right.
And if you're part of the victim group, then you've been oppressed. You could be a multi-millionaire, you could be a billionaire, but if you're in that group, then you're labeled or identified as oppressed. And this is what's happening in America, is instead of recognizing that we're individuals and every individual has their own story, and there should be a standard that we all function and live by, right? That there is truth, there is reality, and we want to, like I did the Justice is Blind, we want to judge people not based on the color of their skin. If we go back to MLK Jr.'s famous "I Have a Dream" speech, his dream, right? I mean, the leader of the civil rights movement back in the 1960s, his dream was that one day his daughters, Black daughters, would be able to live in a nation where they were not judged by the color of their skin, but rather by the content of their character. Well, the way it's going today is people say, we don't really care about the content of your character. We care about the color of your skin. That's a very Marxist idea. That it matters more what group you're in, because if you're in this group, then you're an oppressor. If you're in this group, then you're a victim. You've been oppressed regardless of your life story, circumstances, or your actual scenario.
And it changes, right? It blows with the wind. It's about being the right type of oppressed individual. It's about being the right skin color, the right gender or lack thereof of gender identification at the right time. And there's no rhyme or reason to that. So it's a little bit difficult to kind of pinpoint at this time. And I think that, I love your opinion on this. It seems to be that, when we're looking across the board at especially our younger generations and where they're trying to land right now, that we're sort of almost taking away, removing any individuality, any uniqueness, because there's this striving to be the type of the moment, right? To be the kind of hot thing, to be the oppressed or the victim of the moment. And what we're seeing in trends across the board because of that is, not even just taking out the concept of like America still so much better off and people who live in this country have so much more opportunity than in other countries, even just siloing Americans just for a moment, to have these generations coming forward where they can't even be valued for just truly who they are. They're constantly trying to fit into some other lane or be put into some other bucket because it gets them benefits, right?
Right.
I just think they're searching. Our generations are searching. And understanding what has happened in this nation to make it this land of opportunity.
Yeah.
And so different from other nations. And we're not hearing what's going on really in North Korea. We're not really hearing what's going on in China. We're sort of getting that filter, right? We're getting that propaganda filter. And so what you have to say, Tim, is so critical and so important that people understand the differences, the freedoms that we have here to decide your gender, to decide your religion, to change it, to have options, to have choice, to have freedoms, that is so unusual here.
Yes.
And it's just interesting that a lot of the youth now are discouraged and disappointed in America for reasons that if you took those complaints to China, you took those complaints to North Korea, I mean, what would happen to you? You'd be put into those slave labor camps. I mean, and here we have the ability to express those opinions so freely, and even have people quite often sort of rush to you to try to fix the things that you might be complaining about. So I appreciate that you're giving us this foundational understanding, because this is one of the narratives I think that does need to be corrected is, yes, we've had difficult things in our history. Yes, we can always do better, but everyone can always do better and every nation can always do better. In the scheme of nations, just generally, in your opinion, what we have with our Constitution, what we have with our set of laws, our freedoms, I mean, how are we doing, Tim?
Yeah.
Are we number one? Aren't we doing better than any other nation? I mean, do you guys have this conversation where every now and again, and it's a tough game to play, I'll tell you that, it's the where would you go conversation.
Right. And there are places, I mean, we heard this over many election cycles. Different people from Hollywood say, if so-and-so gets elected, then I'm leaving. They never
Canada,
leave.
And
right?
They don't go.
I mean, I mean, there's so much irony to these positions because it's easy to fantasize about somewhere else, right? I mean, this is human nature again. When you're growing up as a kid, no matter how good you have it, you don't always know you have it good. And it's easy to look at someone else and go, man, I wish I had their life. I wish I had their opportunities. And it's easy to look at other nations and think, man, I wish we could be like there.
Sure.
But if you've never been there, you don't actually know what it's like there. And you don't understand sometimes that where you have it is so stinking good because you don't have any kind of comparison. You don't have context. So therefore you don't have the level of understanding to know. And I mean, kind of coming back full circle on this, right? Talking about how did America become America? Like, what's the story on this? This is where it's so fascinating, where we are and we can look at the nations of the world and where we are today, we are at a place where the government is dictating who can do what, who can go where, who has what privileges, who doesn't have what privileges. And the exact reason America became a nation, you can go back and read our founding document. It's the Declaration of Independence. In the second paragraph, the founding fathers said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. On it goes. But their starting premise is that we were created. And we were created equal. So that's a big deal, right? That we all have equal value, regardless of the color of your hair or your eyes or your body right? Your body shape, your body size. Like, no. We are all equal value. That's what the founding fathers believed. We are all created equal, but they acknowledge we're endowed by our creator with certain rights because we're created and we have equality from creation. And it doesn't mean that we have equality of outcome, right? It doesn't mean we all started from the same place, where some people, their family was very wealthy, some people was very poor. But the great and amazing thing about America is it didn't matter where you started. You had an equal opportunity to achieve success. And some of the most successful people in America today started from way behind where other people started. But in America, where you have freedom, you have opportunity, you can work hard, you can achieve. Like, this used to be known as the American dream, that you can accomplish and do great things. Well, they recognize we are created equal, but we have rights that come from God. And this was the big distinction, because at that time we were largely English colonies in America, right? I mean, that's kind of where America started. And under the king at that time was King George III. King George III said, you only have the rights that I give you. And actually in America, the king revoked the British Bill of Rights for the American colonies.
Oh, wow.
Now, like, I mean, really, like, imagine what if we had a president one day who was like, okay, you no longer have the freedom of speech. You don't have the freedom of religion. You don't have the freedom of press or assembly or petition. You don't have the freedom of private property. You don't have the freedom of self-defense. Like, all of these freedoms in the Bill of Rights. What if we had a president say that? Because that's what the King of England did to the English colonies in America. And that's when they were like, okay, first of all, our rights don't come from you. They come from our creator. So, right, you cannot arbitrarily choose what rights we do and don't have. But this is also what made America so different, is they then went further and said, the role of government. They said, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, meaning the reason government exists is to protect our rights, not to give us our rights, not to define our rights. It's to protect our rights. If you go to almost any other nation in the world, even Canada, they do not have a Bill of Rights in Canada that protects your freedom of speech. That does not exist. That also doesn't exist in France. It doesn't exist in Germany. Like, that is not a thing in the world. That's a thing largely in America. Like, there's a few other nations that have things similar to it. It's not the same. America was different because we were the only nation that we created a government to limit our political officials and leaders, to say, there's certain things you can never do, you can never touch. In fact, the Bill of Rights was written as a negative listing of things. The government can never do this. That's why the Bill of Rights starts off with the phrase that Congress shall make no law, and then it goes through all the things that Congress can't do. So Congress can't make a law to limit or infringe on any of these. Well, that also means the president. That means the Supreme Court or the judicial branch in general. The government can never limit our rights. Their job, in fact, is to protect our rights. But we are at a place now that, because we know so little history, we don't really know as a nation, like, who we are, where we came from, why did we become a nation? We've started buying into a different idea about America, or even a different idea about the government, that really, the government is the one, they're going to solve our problems. And I think for so many people, they've never seriously pondered the reality that if government is the one that gives you rights, government can take them away. And even though, right, we might look and go, yeah, but I'm okay because we've got the right political leaders there. Okay, if you like the political leaders we have, that's fine. What happens if those political leaders change?
Exactly.
Would you want people that you disagree with to have the ability to silence you, to censor you, to kick you off social media platforms? Like, do you want them to have that power and authority?
That's such a key point that you're bringing up here right now, because a lot of this is being challenged, and some of it's even being challenged up to the Supreme Court. What really are our rights? How far can we push things? Because there are people who are trying to push the limits, so to speak. But you're absolutely right. I think one of the most misunderstood concepts in our country, in our government, is a separation of church and state. And what you are explaining and backing up with historical fact is the reason that America was established, and that we don't all live in England right now under monarchy rule, is because the point is that religion is at the top, our right to believe what we want and worship how we choose, and government supports that and not the other way around.
Right.
And a lot of people believe that separation of church and state means that religion can never infiltrate any of our government processes or any of our documentation or anything like that. But all we have to do is go back to the very beginning, to these incredible documents. I mean, when you read the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, they're beautiful. I think they're not that long. I encourage everyone just to look them up and read the language, because it really is inspiring to hear how the founders wrote essentially these protections for people who are going to live in America. It really is for the people and for their greatest benefit. It isn't saying this is how we're going to control you and tell you what to do. It's saying you're free and this is how we keep it. This is how we keep a good thing going. Our Constitution has survived longer than any other nation's constitution, and I certainly hope it survives for in perpetuity. But it's really amazing how you're exactly right. I think that we've gotten this misconception now that things are going in a bad direction and government should step in. The more that happens, it doesn't quite seem like they're sorting the problems out. And we have some problems racking up here. So I think it's really critical that, we keep going back to the beginning, look at what are the intentions, how does this go best for our country? And so I love the work that you guys are doing at WallBuilders, because you're doing just that and educating everyone on how uniquely special our founding was, and those founding documents were too. I have an interesting note and then some statistics I want to read to you, because I'm curious. I just read a statistic that says 60% of Americans believe the founders intended America to be a Christian nation. Okay, 60% we're at right now, which is actually maybe a little bit more than I would think, because there is this ongoing debate. You know this better than anybody, that some people say, the founders, they weren't Christian. America is not a Christian nation. We hear that a lot. We should have better separation of church and state, and the conversations kind of go on from there. Even though 60% believe it was founded as a Christian nation, only a third of Americans now believe it's a Christian nation today. Yet here's what I found interesting, and I want your take on this. Almost every single United States president has been a Christian, including Joe Biden. He's Catholic. They take the oath of office with a hand on a Bible. 9 in 10 members of Congress identify as Christian. That's 99% of Republicans and 78% of Democrats. This is Pew Research. You can go on Pew's website and see all of this. Our laws are essentially based off of the 10 Commandments. Yet a majority of Americans polled, again through Pew, don't want religion in our schools or our government. You guys do a spiritual heritage tour, because our Capitol building is so chock full of spiritual elements. I guess I'm trying to find the connections here. Help me put these pieces together, Tim.
Yeah,
there's so much evidence. There's so much spiritual, religious, Christian documentation, evidence, traditions threaded through this nation's history to current day. And yet Americans seem to be increasingly in favor of excluding those elements from our day-to-day life. What do you say about that?
Yeah, I think the reason that most Americans are leaning in favor of removing some of this is because they know so little of our history, and they've been taught that this is the way it should be, right? There should be this separation of church and state, which I don't disagree with, but I think we mean different things when we say that.
I think so too.
Because, right, for example, the founding fathers, I mean, they're the ones that are credited with this. Now, technically, or actually not technically, very specifically, the phrase separation of church and state, it doesn't appear in any official founding document. It's not in the Constitution. It's not in the Bill of Rights, not in the Declaration. It came from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to a group of Baptists from Danbury, Connecticut. And it gives so much important understanding and context. He wrote it January 1st, 1802. And in the letter, he was responding to them. They had written him a letter first. You actually can get online. You can see both these letters. A letter from the Danbury Baptists to Jefferson, Jefferson's response to the Danbury Baptists. And what he tells them is that they don't need to worry about having any of their religious freedom threatened from the federal government. Now, to give a little background context, what had been going on at that time, that we are still a very young nation, and it's the era of monarchs in the world. And the way monarchs worked, and had worked for hundreds of years, is monarchs would choose how their nation was going to operate in a faith perspective. Now, monarchs would choose all kinds of stuff. But for example, in England, you can back up to King Henry VIII, and he is the one that created the Anglican Church. And he said, England, we're going to be Anglican. And England was Anglican. And you were not allowed to have any other church than an Anglican church in England. People that tried to start other churches, like William Penn tried to start, well, he didn't necessarily try to start. He was one of the ones that was trying to attend a Quaker meeting. He got arrested. Now, he was the founder of Pennsylvania, but he got arrested for trying to attend a Quaker meeting. But this wasn't just what England did. I mean, in Germany, you had Martin Luther, who did the 95 Thesis on the door of the church in Wittenberg. Well, Germany became a Lutheran belief, like in their nation, that was the religious doctrine they adopted, was the Lutherans. If you go to Scotland, they were Presbyterians. If you go to France and Italy, they were Catholics. This is the way the world was, is whoever the king was, they would choose a specific denomination. And I say denomination, back then they called them religions. All of those religions now fall under the umbrella of Christianity. Right? It's a different kind of church you would go to, whether you go to the Baptist church or the Methodist church, right? The Presbyterian church, the Assembly of God, whatever it is, the Christ Chapel. I mean, there's all these different kinds of churches. You can choose the kind of church, but back then the kings would choose a specific denomination. They would say, everybody in our nation, this is what we believe. So when the founding fathers do the First Amendment, they say Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, meaning that Congress can't come along and choose, in America, we're all going to be Baptists. In America, we're all going to be Catholic. In America, we're all going to be Anglicans. Congress could not do that. That literally, this is part of the First Amendment. They wanted to make sure that we didn't do what was happening all over Europe, what had been going on for hundreds of years. They said, we believe in the freedom of religion. But what's interesting, when Jefferson writes his letter to the Danbury Baptists in January 1st in 1802, he's explaining some of this to them. And what he says is, you don't need to worry about having your religious liberty threatened in America. He says Congress has already erected a wall to protect you. It's a wall of separation between church and state to keep you safe, so the government can never interfere on your religious practice. But a very important distinction, the founding fathers believed in separate institutions. They never advocated for secular institutions. Right? Like, government is different than church, but they never thought government should be secular. Part of how we know this. Jefferson wrote that letter, January 1st, 1802. That was a Friday. On Sunday, now Jefferson is president at the time. On that Sunday, January 3rd, Thomas Jefferson attended church in the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C., which at the time was where the largest Protestant church in America was meeting.
Oh, that's incredible. Wow.
Now, right, if Jefferson had believed, like, no, you can't mix religion and government.
And
then why is he going to church
on over to the Capitol and having church service? Yeah, that's amazing.
And to even go further, the preacher who was preaching that day was the Reverend John Leland. Well, why was John Leland there? Thomas Jefferson had personally invited him to come preach in the Capitol that Sunday. He was one of Jefferson's friends. And so not only is Jefferson attending church, he's actually bringing the pastor in to come preach in the church. Now, again, why this matters is because today people say, no, separation of church and state. You can't have religion in government. That's not what that means, right? And this is where we can go back historically, and it's so easy to show. And this is not an argument that every single founding father was a Christian. That's not this argument. But it is very clear that the way we are applying separation of church and state today is not the way it was intended, number one. But then number two, when we're looking at this thought, was America founded as a Christian nation? There was a group of professors from the University of Houston back in the 80s and 90s, and they had this idea. They wanted to go back to the founders' writings, and they wanted to see who were the most influential people to the founding fathers. Because if you can
that's
see,
an interesting research topic.
And this is before the days of the internet, right? So it's not like you can do a quick Google search. Their idea was they were going to take 15,000 of the founders' writings, and they're going to read them all. And every time there was a quotation mark anywhere in that writing, they were going to make a note of that, and they were going to go find that citation so they could see who are the founders quoting, because then we can see like who is really influencing the founding fathers. Then we'll have a pretty good idea of what was the main source of influence and ideas for the founding fathers. And so it took them years and years and years, and they found thousands of quotes, and they have to take them all back to the original source. Like, where did this quote come from? Oh, it came from this guy, from this book and this writing. So an incredible research project. A lot of like research assistants involved in this, right? Grad assistants along the way. But at the end of it, what they discovered, the number one cited individual was Charles Montesquieu. He did some commentaries on the law, really interesting philosophical thinker. Then second, and 8.3% of the quotes were from Charles Montesquieu. 7.9% of the quotes came from William Blackstone. He did Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England. And his law books helped lay the foundation for America's understanding of the law, how it applied in our nation. And then third place was John Locke. 2.9% of the quotes came from John Locke. And then it keeps falling from there. Now, those were the top three cited individuals. That was not the top cited source. These professors, and worth noting, these professors, they were not Christian. In fact, they weren't even really conservative. They were just intellectually honest, and they said, we're going to pursue this to where it leads us. We want to find what the truth is, and we just want to see what's the truth, what really influenced them. What they discovered, the number one source in the founders' writings, with 34% of all the quotes in their writings were from the Bible. And what they acknowledged is unquestionably the most significant influence on the founding fathers was the Bible. And this is where if you go back and study their writings, and you don't have to be any kind of motivated, like, well, I'm a conservative, I'm a Christian. No, like, just be intellectually honest. Just go back and read and study their writings, and it's so evident. And I have read thousands upon thousands upon thousands of their books and their letters and their proclamations. And it's so evident. The problem is today, most people have never done the research, and they're believing a narrative, which in fairness, like that's a lot of research to do.
Too much research.
Right. Like, nobody.
We can't all be you, Tim.
No, nobody has time for that.
This is the point here. This is exactly the point here. And I love this moment because you're just like fulfilling all my politically basic dreams. But we have cracked your brain open. And this is what it is, right? Nobody's got the time. No one knows where to go. We are flooded with so many different influences and so much information. We also are trying our darndest to discern what's real, what's true, what we can rely on, what's fake news, AI, misinformation. Who knows if community notes are any good? I don't. But you have to approach a level of like a research assistant at some point to try to dig into some of this, but you have done it. I mean, your wealth of knowledge is just absolutely mind-blowing. And I know that we're barely scratching the surface with you today, but you're absolutely right. We've got to get this information, and I love hearing it from you, because America, our founders clearly, people have taken the time. They've spent the time and dug through the research and picked it apart and seen the Bible was the major influence of our founding fathers. Yeah. And then they have
and this is where I would encourage this is where I would encourage people too. And we say this often, please, don't take my word for this. If you're listening and you're like, I'm not sure about this. Yes. Just think I'm crazy and go look it up. Right. Because what happens is so often we form our decisions and our opinions based on information we heard from somebody. But the reality is truth is not insecure, right? Truth doesn't mind being questioned, because if you're looking for truth, you can discover truth. It is knowable. It is findable, especially when it comes to original history. There's documentation for it. Where there's a problem is, right, there are some people who say, oh, you shouldn't question me because I have credentials, right? Sure. I have a certain degree. I teach at a university or whatever it is, right? I have this huge following on social media. I have this really big platform. How dare you question me? But you have to know the truth is not insecure. And so anytime someone says that you just need to trust me, just take my word for it, that's when you should become the most skeptical
Absolutely.
ever.
That's
because,
good. That's good advice.
Who are the people that are really trying to censor, right? It's the reason that there are some people that say, just take my word for it, is because they know if you actually investigate, it might undercut their position, because the truth would disprove their argument. And this is where you start looking at some of this. And again, please don't take my word for it. We do a lot of writing because we try to synthesize this and make it much more available and palatable and fun stories about some of these incredible people. But we will put footnotes at the back of everything we write. We've written a couple books over the last couple of years, and there's more than 1,000 footnotes in the back of both of these books. And we encourage people, please don't take our word for it. I'm telling you, here's what they said. And I'm telling it in the story. So you're learning the story, and I'm like, and they said this, and you're like, what? That's crazy. I want you to know the story. Yeah. But then I document, where did they say that? Because I don't want you just to believe blindly in what someone says. I want you to know why we can know this, because John Adams actually wrote this, because Samuel Adams wrote, John Hancock, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, this is their actual letter where they wrote this. You can go read this letter for yourself. It's available online. We show you where to find it. We are not trying to be the small end of the funnel and say that, well, you have to believe me and whatever I say, I'm going to give you. No. That is a very foolish perspective. Unfortunately, a lot of professors, right? A lot of news outlets, this is what they argue. You just need to come to me to find the truth. That's silly, right? You don't have to go to one source, one person, one news outlet, right? One website to find the truth. But there are places that can point you to the right direction so you can know, where can I do my research, right? Because if you're online and I'm like, okay, let me Google George Washington real quick.
Oh boy.
Oh my gosh. Sure. Hundreds of thousands of pages.
And then you're going to stop immediately. So I love the transparency that your credibility is off the charts just by saying that. And I mean, I don't know, fact checkers of America, the bar has been set really high, but just by virtue of you saying that, I mean, you are so well researched. You guys, you have the documentation, you spend day in and out doing this, and I'm so glad that you do, because you're certainly the most brilliant at it, but you're able to break it down for those of us who aren't able to spend all of our days doing that, and I'm so grateful for it. And I want to ask you a couple of really basic questions. I want to get your basic answers to them, and again, encourage everyone to read the books that you have written, because we're just scratching the surface here on this. You've written now 2 volumes of Our American Story. You have The Beginnings and Rebuilding the Republic, which is brand new. That's out and available now. Is that right?
Yes.
on
Yeah, both of them are called
wallbuilders.com?
The American Story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, wallbuilders.com, or anywhere you get books. Amazon, wherever you get books, you can find them. They're called The American Story. The first one is The American Story, The Beginnings. The second one is The American Story, Building the Republic. Wallbuilders.com is an easy place to go to find them.
They are really incredible reads because, again, we have only been able to talk about just a little portion of these stories. But my takeaway and what I think is so remarkable and inspiring is what people risked to found America. What people were so driven to and motivated for that led us to the creation of this nation and why it's so special. I mean, it's just a harrowing read when you learn about the time it took, the sacrifice, the heart, the courage, the strength, the endurance. I mean, it's just one of the most inspiring stories. So I'm so glad that you've written the second one. I can't wait to finish getting through that. Wallbuilders.com has got those. But Tim, couple quick basic questions. Were America's founders racist? Yes or no?
No. Now,
unequivocally?
So no, not unequivocally, because there's more than 200 that would be considered America's founders. But for example, if you look at like the signers of the Declaration, there were 56 guys that signed the Declaration, and I would say 2/3 of them actually came out against slavery. And there's another third, and some of them they were pretty pro-slavery. So it's a mixed bag.
Yeah.
But the majority of the founding fathers were very anti-slavery. And this is going to be a hot take, right? I'm sure like somebody's going to write this up and make me look, try to make me look dumb for saying it, but
can't wait. My name is Kyle. Get me in there.
Right. But I would also point out, like, there were some people that grew up in an institution that slavery was normal. It was a condition of the world, right? We look at slavery in America and people are like, oh, America was evil. No, like in the 1700s, name a nation that didn't have slaves.
Right.
And you can't. And it's not and I'm not saying this like to defend America. I'm saying it to give context that slavery was the normal position of the world. If you were a person of money, influence, and power, right? If you are a leader of a nation, politically speaking, the odds were incredibly high, pretty much unanimous. You had slaves. It's the way it was. And the reason that matters is that there were some founding fathers that owned slaves, and they were like, I don't think this is right. Like, I feel like this is wrong. And the reason that matters is I would argue there were some founding fathers that owned slaves that weren't racist. And today people would be like, no, you can't own slaves and not be racist. And no, like when you are dealing something with that the entire world accepts as the norm, and you begin to question the norm, that actually puts you in a pretty unique category, because you're questioning what the rest of the world says is normal, and you're going, I don't think this is right. There were founding fathers that owned slaves that even questioned the legitimacy, the moral position of slavery. And so there were some founding fathers that I would say owned slaves and were not racist. So big picture breakdown, I would say probably 2/3 of the founding fathers were anti-slavery, not racist. There were 1/3 that were pro-slavery, but there might even be a couple on that pro-slavery side that they might have been promoting the institution. Like, guys, this is normal. Because what they said is like, this is normal. It's like from the time of the Bible, right? We've always had slavery. It's normal. And maybe they weren't even saying that we think we should enslave more Africans, because, right, for some of them, maybe they had Irish slaves, right? They might have had Asian slaves. So it wasn't that they were racist in slavery. They were promoting an evil institution, I will give you. But I would argue that racism and slavery can be separate things. And I think for some of them, it might have been. So it's a longer answer than I wanted to give, but I want to give a little
really
nuance.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I haven't heard it broken down that way, so I'm grateful for it. Yeah, I'm gonna save my other basic questions for after this. So you're on politically basic, but sometimes people are politically extra. So we have a politically extra moment of our week, and this week we've got I don't know if you saw this interview. I think Elon Musk retweeted it. This was It was fascinating. I want to put this to you. I'm going to read literally the quotes because it was so I guess it's a peek truly into what some of the youth of our country are thinking right now. So it's a man on the street interview, and we've got a masked protester with a sign that says "End the War on Gaza," saying the person interviewing him was not a real journalist, and he would know because he just got fired as a journalist. So take that as you will. But this is what he says. Quote, so the protest he's at is, quote, about getting rid of America, getting rid of the West. At some level, get rid of America completely. And the interviewer says, what should we do then? And the protester says, quote, decolonization, land back. And our interviewer says, where should we go? And the protester says, quote, in our communities. Leave the capitals, leave the central capitals of commerce, of capital itself. Okay, if you want to try to decode that word salad, number one, I love man on the street interviews, man/woman on the street interviews, because quite often who's being interviewed is someone who is protesting something. They have a stance, they have a position, they are trying to affect change. And when they're asked about what the problem is, to describe it and then to explain their position, I'd say most of it, like strong majority of the time, the person has a very difficult time explaining why they're upset and what needs to change and how it can change. So here we have someone saying that we need to get rid of America, literally get rid of the West and decolonize. What's your take? Should we call it? Should we call America because and scrap capitalism because we potentially are doing too well? Are we harming people in our success? What do you say to this thought? And then the reason I bring it up is because this is a thread. You know, people are saying similar things and believing similar things. What do you say about this?
Yeah, this goes back to the idea from Marx, where Marx's idea, there's only two categories of people, the oppressed and the oppressors. Part of Marx's idea is that you need to have revolutions in a nation. You need to overthrow the system and structure of power, because then you can build something back different in its place. And so this idea of destroying America, it's very much a Marxist idea. And people are embracing it, not even really knowing what they're embracing.
Sure.
And for those that are not up to speed on Marxism, socialism, communism, Marxism are all siblings, right? Like they are all related. They're different stages, right? It's like different ages of the same family. They're all the same family. All of these ideas have been very destructive. If you look over the last 100 years alone, more than 100 million people have died at the hands of socialist, communist, Marxist leaders.
Right.
In
where is
nations.
it going well?
Like
in which country is socialism, communism, or Marxism a success story?
That is 100% the question we should be asking.
Yeah.
I would point out, right, for when I talk to especially high school and college students, if the idea of socialism comes up, I will ask them, right, do you want in your life, would you love to like make a lot of money where you have the ability to like buy whatever car, buy the house, you know, the clothes, the food, like wouldn't it be amazing? Like one day just have all this incredible money? And they go, well, yeah, of course.
Sure.
Like, okay, let me add one more. Wouldn't it be amazing, or isn't it amazing, right? That we have the freedom, like we can choose where we want to work or not work. We can choose where we want to build a home or buy a home. We can choose, like, if we had the money,
Sure.
right? We could choose all of these things, the car, the clothes. So I like the idea of money and freedom. I love both of those so much. And then I pose the question, can you name any nation in the history of the world that once they embraced socialism, it increased or improved people's personal prosperity or their personal freedom? Because it's never happened in the history of the world that a nation embraced socialism and then people had more freedom and more personal prosperity. But we're embracing ideas not knowing what it is. Now that's part of it. What I would then say further, there's a lot of, in kind of modern education, we have been taught to memorize and repeat, right? A very common phrase. Teachers say, hey, everybody, listen up. Hey, listen, write this down. It's going to be on your test. We are taught to memorize and repeat. And we're not often taught to be critical thinkers, to be problem solvers. And part of that is revealed in some of these conversations, Because if you're going to say, well, we should give the land back. Okay, who should we give the land back to? Well, we should give it, like in America, we should give it back to the natives. Okay, which tribe? Let's just go with me for a second. Let's start. Which tribe should we give it to? And this becomes fascinating because in the history of America, right, however old you think America is and that natives have lived here, right, for hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands, like whatever you think that number is, it's worth noting that the history of natives in America has been the history of conquest, of war.
Right.
And for example, William Penn, super easy example. William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania, he was a Quaker. The King of England gave William Penn that land as an inheritance because William Penn's father was the Admiral William Penn. He had won all these battles. The king owed him money, like this commission for winning all these wars. And he said, I don't really have the money. I've got this land. Let me give you land. I'm gonna name it after you. To honor you, we'll call it Pennsylvania, right? William Penn's a Quaker. He comes and becomes known as like the founder of Pennsylvania. But when he comes with Quakers to America. And Quakers were always anti-war. They were always anti-slavery. That was kind of their moral foundation. And William Penn, they begin building a colony in Pennsylvania, and they encounter a native tribe. And they're able to converse. And this tribe was like, what are you guys doing here? And they said, we're building. And the tribe was like, well, like this is our territory. And William Penn's like, guys, we're so sorry. We were told, right? Like the king said he owned it all. We didn't know it was yours. Can we buy it from you? And the tribe's like, yes. And so they work this exchange. They continue building. A second tribe comes along. And the second tribe is like, hey, what are you guys doing? And William Penn's like, we're building a colony. And they're like, but this is our land. You can't be here. And William Penn's like, man, our bad. Like first the king gave it to us, but then this tribe, but now you're saying it's you. Okay, we didn't know, our bad. Can we buy it from you?
Right.
They bought it from a second tribe at a price agreed to, right? Mutually agreed to. They're continuing their colony. A third tribe comes along.
Oh gosh.
William Penn bought the area of Pennsylvania from 3 different tribes. Why? Because all 3 tribes had been warring over that territory for decades, if not centuries. And the reason this matters, this is the history of every nation. It's the history of who conquered who to be the next leader. And so if you're going to say, give it back to people, well, who does it ultimately go to?
Exactly.
Right. And this is where, and I'm not saying this like for this gotcha moment, but I'm saying it like, understand the reality. When you're talking about a world in an era that was the era of conquest, like this is the way it was. It was the era of conquest. Natives in America, like that's, certainly there were some tribes that tried to live peacefully, but once they had used all of the availability of growing crops in the ground, right? Because all the minerals, it's gone, and they have to go somewhere else. Often they would war with a tribe where they're going, and if they lost, they were enslaved by that tribe. If they won, then they got this new land and territory. And there were some tribes, they didn't even want to grow crops. They just wanted to kill other tribes and take their stuff from them. That's the history of America, but it's the history of the world. And I want to be clear, like I'm not picking on natives. This is the history of the world.
No, it happened everywhere. You see it all over, you know, the Middle East and countries since the beginning of time, and biblical times and forever. Absolutely.
So when people look at America and they're like, right, white people are bad because they came and set up colonies, and right, they're the colonizers. Okay, lots of things to understand, right? Like up until Andrew Jackson, the vast majority of the land in America had been either purchased from the native tribes, or it had been land that was won in wars that America did not start. So if you back up historically, and I don't want to take a lot of time doing this, but like you have the French and Indian War where the British and the Americans are against the French. And as this unfolds, there's native tribes on both sides. And the French tell the natives, hey, you join us, we conquer them, we give you all the land. The British were like, hey, fight with us, we conquer them, you get all their land. And what happened is for every time a native tribe joined a military in a battle, if they lost that battle, they lost the land as part of losing that war. And so you have native tribes that lost land to the French, or because they sided with the French. Well, then the American Revolution, there were native tribes that sided with the British. And when they lost, part of the peace agreement was America, or at that time, right, the early American colonies, they were going to control that land. And this wasn't even Americans being mean and like genocide of the natives, This was the reality of conquest.
Yeah.
And this was not something that Americans specifically targeted natives and said, we're going to take you out. We don't like you, et cetera. It is a far more detailed, intricate, and even complex history. But now when you get to Andrew Jackson, at this point, Andrew Jackson, super racist, violates 71 native treaties, takes all kinds of land. Like I mentioned, we had a conversation earlier, and I mentioned that if you go in American history, like there was definitely times we had leaders that did some really evil things.
Right.
Yeah, starting from like Andrew Jackson, Van Buren, he's the one that did the Trail of Tears. There's some really awful moments in American history.
Sadly, yes.
But that's not how America was founded, number one. And number two, that didn't define all of America, because just like when you have the Trail of Tears, anytime you look at an atrocity in America, it's interesting. We should ask the questions, how did the atrocity end, or why did it end? And who led the opposition movement to help bring it to an end?
Right.
Because nobody talks about this, right?
No.
We talk about slavery in America, and people don't talk about the abolition movement. We talk about the Indian relocation, and we don't talk about the fact that the Supreme Court, actually, there was two different cases. The Supreme Court told Andrew Jackson, what you're doing is unconstitutional. You can't do it. And Andrew Jackson said, I have a military. You don't try to stop me.
Wow.
And the Supreme Court said, at least we in good conscience know we have not done something immoral and unethical against the natives living in our land. Now, the reason, again, it matters, not everybody was in favor of this. America, certainly, we had a leader in America do this, but people want to take a moment in America, and especially if you had an evil leader do evil things and they say all of America is guilty of this. No, a lot of America actually opposed it. Right. And this is where we just point out there's so much more to the story that the reason America overcame some of these evils faster than virtually anywhere else in the world is because there always were people with a moral foundation. And what's actually kind of fun, as a person of faith, I can look back and point out virtually every leader of the movements against these atrocities, whether it's slavery or Indian relocation or anything else you might name, the leaders fighting against those evils to put a stop to it, it was always Christians. It was pastors. It was churches. It was people of faith motivated by the morals they learned from their faith to work to put a stop to it. And this was another reason people used to know that America had this Christian foundation and Christian beginning, because it was the influence of Christianity more than virtually anything else that helped America do the good, and that led the movements to stop the bad. That was really who America was.
Wow. Yeah, our pastors were warriors, weren't they? They were leading our educational institutions like Princeton and Yale. Some people don't know that. Those universities were started to train up pastors. Our Christian heritage is everywhere in this nation. You just summed it up so beautifully. And again, I just think it's so inspirational, and such a fundamental part of who we are as a nation still. I'm so glad to hear all of this from you. It's endlessly fascinating. I could just sit here until dinner time and listen to everything that you have to say, Tim. I'm going to have you back on the show, and we'll try to narrow down the topics, but you did a really good job in giving us the basics of our founding and our history as it relates to some of these kind of hot topics of what people are focusing on right now, and how we've gotten a little bit off track here. And so being brought back, being grounded again in what is true and what is real, as it relates to how America became a nation, and how we operate spiritually, legally, and otherwise today. It's just really good. So I'm so grateful to you. I want to have more conversations soon. I hope that you'll come back on Politically Basic again so that we can keep talking about this. But we got to a lot today, and I'm really grateful. So for our listeners, please check out wallbuilders.com. I really strongly encourage you all to get the American Story books. They are some of the best reads. I cannot recommend them enough. It will probably change your life in the way that you understand, I think, the blessing that being able to live in this country really, truly is. And it shades and colors what we think about our political life, our everyday life and our political life. And as I always say, politics affects us every day. in a number of ways. So please go to wallbuilders.com or anywhere allegedly books are sold. I love that. Anywhere you can buy books, and pick those up. But you guys have great resources on your website as well, including some just really phenomenal sermons, articles, and all kinds of amazing things. So please check it out. But Tim, again, thank you for your time. Thank you for what you're doing too, because as you know, someone who is just cramming as much historical, factual information in that brain as possible, we're grateful to you for the work that you're doing. So thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Hope to have you on again soon. And thank you all for joining us. Don't forget to go to politicallybasic.com to learn more about this discussion, for links, for resources on our website. Follow us at Politically Basic on the socials for this episode and more information. I'm Kyle Campbell, and this has been Politically Basic, where we give you the basics of all political issues and let you decide.